Okay, we can start maybe. Apparently I'm losing my voice. We wish to welcome you to the 7th presentation in the noon lecture series of the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies for winter 2023. The complete series schedule is available here today and on China Center's website. Email reminders are sent out weekly. So we will begin with a few announcements. The next presentation in the winter 2023 LRCCS noon lecture series will take place on Tuesday, March 28, and will be given by Ethan Michelson, professor of sociology and law at Indiana University, Bloomington, who will be speaking on decoupling gender injustice in China's divorce courts. We kindly request that a mic be used to ask questions during the Q&A so that our virtual audience can hear your questions. Today's presentation will be given by the great Michael Nylan, Professor of History at the University of California, Berkeley. Professor Nylan generally writes in 3 disciplines: the history of early empires in China, philosophy, and art and archaeology. Of late, she has been focusing on the socio-political context for local communities in China, on aesthetic theories and material culture, cosmological belief, and on gender history and the history of such emotions, such as daring and salutary fear or prudential caution. She's finishing up 2 books, a mammoth translation of the Han era documents classic, and a book tentatively titled The Forefathers of History on Herodotus, Thucydides, Sima Qian, and Bangu. Her comparative interests have been highlighted in such books as Chang'an, 26 BCE, and Augustan Age in Rome, and the Chinese Pleasure Book, as well as in numerous essays. Today, she will be speaking on Xunzi and Aristotle on freedom. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thanks very much. Can people hear me? Okay, that's great. What I would like to do is thank you all. I think Sonia and I were discussing this talk before the pandemic. And so many things, as we all know, have been delayed by that. It's good to finally be here among friends and meeting some new people as well. I will begin. There is so much underbrush to be swept away when it comes to Chinese studies, not to mention comparative philosophy, that I would like to begin my talk with 2 modern observations, if I may, in order to better ground this talk in contemporary concerns. The first comes from Fei Xiaotong, the eminent anthropologist whose portrait of Chineseness was confirmed by the sociologist Mayfair Yang in the early post-Mao era. Fei described the Chinese as operating in a distinctive and distinctively Chinese differential mode of association, that's a quote, in the socio-political sphere, defined as highly personal networks that expand or contract with unusual rapidity, dependent as they are entirely on personal, idiosyncratic connections, rather than, and he was contrasting this to the organizational modes of association he ascribed to EuroAmerica, which made, he believed, for longer and stronger ties, buffering the individual from the state. By the way, I'm always happy to send a talk or a PowerPoint to anybody, so if you feel like taking notes, take notes. If you don't feel like taking notes, just email me and ask me for everything you would like, okay? Fei Xiaotong was an excellent anthropologist, and I am no Republican-era expert. But the world he conjured in his village studies is in no way like the early empires in China, the world I study. Still, Fei wrote and presumably believed that top-down rule must be a reflection of age-old Asian values, or Confucian legalist autocracy, i.e., traditional rule with Chinese characteristics. I would ask you to suspend belief in Fei's influential analysis for an hour or so that we can more clearly see the world according to Xunzi in antiquity. There are two cogent reasons for doing this. Xunzi, plus a few chapters of the Documents Classic, provided the basic theoretical models for good governance during the early empires. Note, I am not saying the Analects and the Mencius provided the theoretical models. These were really very unimportant in the early empires. Number two, we know, thanks to recently archaeologically excavated documents from the Qin and Han periods, roughly the first 2 centuries BC and AD, that the courts of the early empires sought to implement Xunzi's model as far as they could, given the limited transportation and communication facilities of the time. Importantly, if Fei's village life does not map onto the world of early China that I study, then he, in company with many others, has Chinese tradition and governing with Chinese characteristics dead wrong. There is no ethnic or biological necessity for autocratic one-man rule. That is not the age-old Chinese way. The second modern piece of writing I would briefly bring to your attention before delving into Xunzi is the German psychologist Karl Gruss, reporting as early as 1901 that children experience and communicate extraordinary pleasure when they figure out they can cause predictable effects in the real world. They can say rice and someone gives them rice. Gruss called this pleasure at being the cause, evident in all forms of play and meaning construction, including playful exchanges and between people. By Gruss's theory, human development consists in ever more intricate and ever more absorbing forms of play and meaning construction, whether it's playing chess, oboe practice, or writing philosophy. And this kind of play, absorbing play, can induce ever keener pleasures, no matter how difficult and intricate the activity, unless the person's desires to interact with the larger world are cruelly thwarted or undermined. The phenomenon Gruss described could not vary more from the Nietzschean will to power, i.e. the will to dominate others, nor from the people routinely described by the Kantians and neo-Kantians. I mention Gruss here because I believe his work tallies with the place that Xunzi accords ritualized behavior, which he says satisfies the person's sense of things, with the pleasure growing progressively keener as the person advances in maturity, intricate role-playing, and rationality. I'll talk more on rationality later. Put another way, if we humans have not been utterly deformed by our societies, we humans tend to share what one might call pleasure in the potential to create effects. And this goes way beyond the personal to color all socio-political relations. We long for secure connections and for predictable approbation, despite the Kantians and neo-Kantians' insistence that we are individual, autonomous, rational beings who experience the need to separate the individual from the community or realm, the moral from the pragmatic, the rational from the emotional. With Fei Xiaotong, Nietzsche, and all the Kantians firmly off the table then, and with Gruss firmly in mind, let me now try to expound some of the main ideas we can find in Xunzi, ideas that represent resources for those of us who feel trapped in today's endless modern binaries. Since surprisingly few in Chinese studies or in comparative philosophy are familiar with Xunzi's ideas, except insofar as a badly mistranslated slogan seems to oppose ideas in the Mencius, Let me begin with the 4 essential building blocks in Xunzi. Building blocks, as it were, which are both simple and powerful. Apologies to those who have actually read the Xunzi. Let me begin with fun division or differentiation. Xunzi has a sense, correct as far as we know, that all civilized societies are complex in the sense that they exhibit divisions. One of the most obvious divisions is between those who rule and those who are ruled, i.e., this is an occupational division. But complex societies exhibit many more divisions than that. Today, a farmer is not often a candle maker, nor is an academic often a car mechanic. In Xunzi's days, the poorest farmer fed others, but he nonetheless needed to purchase a number of items, including tools for working the soil and coffins for burying the dead. Moreover, the old are not young, women are not men, and so on, with different treatments to be accorded people by virtue of their ages, genders, and occupations. Indeed, the basic survival of the society, in Xunzi's view, let alone its flourishing, depends upon societal recognition of these basic divisions. At the same time, the more complex the society, the more divisions it will likely generate, and the predictable result of such divisions is often conflict, if not downright chaos, unless something or someone intervenes. That explains why Xunzi calls people's basic natures not a pretty sight to see. People are like toddlers snatching toys from each other unless they are taught better behavior. In Xunzi's days, certainly there were thinkers who had another solution. Let's equalize all the members of society. Ergo, in the Mencius, the agriculturalist Xu Xing, who suggests that a single person, the ruler, should farm, make clothes, and perform a multitude of other tasks, as Xu Xing's followers do, and they make their living by weaving mats and growing grain. But, as was easily demonstrated, such calls for perfect equalization were unworkable and arbitrary. For no single person has ever been found who can perform every task that a human being requires to survive, let alone flourish. Time and talent are limited. I speak as a bad oboe player. Xunzi, like Mencius before him, agrees. Indeed, he cites evidence from the Documents classic I'm currently finishing a translation of. What is only equal is profoundly unequal. So Xunzi thinks how to use divisions to promote a better, more stable form of equality. Thankfully, to offset their worst impulses and keep them from being at cross purposes, human beings are equipped with a capacity unique to them, Xunzi says, the only capacity that makes people superior to animals. People can chun, they can join together in collective action with a common purpose to achieve a common goal. Xunzi is not so stupid as to say that all human beings do this well on a regular basis, but that they have the potential to act this way is crucial to his vision of a better world. Note that Xunzi's use of this ordinary word meaning crowd has become a technical term in his work and no works around him. For example, Han Feizi and other works, they never use it for anything except to mean crowd. So it's people's innate ability to join together that allows them, under certain circumstances, to put aside their differences to create something that is larger than each individual person and more satisfying for being larger. Of course, some human goals are quite frankly unachievable. People, try as they might, will never live forever, but acting in concert to improve the world is achievable, in Xunzi's view, under certain quite realistically described conditions. Obviously, the first follow-up question is this: what conditions make it more likely that humans will join together in constructive acts that ultimately improve the world? To answer this question, Xunzi delves into the psychological insofar as he builds upon two basic insights. A, that we as humans rapidly accept as natural and hence inevitable norms and ideas to which we have been habituated. And B, that the human habits can be shaped, I would use the word nudged in the common parlance, towards either constructive or destructive acts by our fundamental mimetic desires to emulate those in more powerful positions. Always, we humans emulate others in the belief that we can thereby secure the social approbation and more tangible rewards that we crave. Ergo, Xunzi's emphasis on accumulating experiences until the weight of those accumulated experiences begins to substantially shape, if not determine, how we see the world and our place in it. Our perceptions rest on two acknowledgments by Xunzi. First, that the reason why equality makes for inequality is that different people make unequal efforts and contributions to the community's greater good. And a person's efforts and communications to the greater good must be recognized if society is to be perceived as fair and so worth our effort and contributions. Second, that habituation to norms of behavior and of reflection are the key to the acquisition of civilized norms of thinking and acting. Habits of the Heart is but one book and one larger project that considers the implications of this in detail, though I sometimes disagree with it. Again, people in Xunzi's world are miraculously lucky in that they have inherited from the days of yore a set of conventional practices that Xunzi calls ritual. Many people in Chinese studies today have spent a great deal of time on the mourning rites in the mistaken belief that filial piety is the goal of all morality in China. This is despite Yang Liansheng's cogent argument in 1957 that Bao, just requital, is the fundamental basis of the Chinese views on ethics and law, past and present, elite and non-elite. And this shared norm of just requital provides a basis for unifying people and groups across long stretches of time and space. Xunzi takes this validation of Bao more or less for granted, and while he seldom used that umbrella term, he grounds his vision of a better world in it in two important ways. In an ideal world, no words would go unanswered, no advice will go unheeded. That's what he means in context. And no virtues unrequited. Okay. He also speaks of the ideal age that prevailed briefly, very briefly, under the sage kings of antiquity, and this he hopes to reintroduce in his own day. And so Xunzi there says, in every case, high rank and official employment and rewards and punishments were all bestowed as requitals, as just compensation for what people had done. They were things, meaning high rank, official employment, rewards, or punishments that followed according to kind or category. If in even a single matter there was a mismatch or an imbalance between act and requital, this was the starting point of chaos. Specifically, this means in the political sphere, realistically speaking, that if someone is entrusted with the care of the altars of soil and grain, i.e., if he is the ruler, but he is not able to care for and benefit the people, he cannot obtain the support of the people when he seeks for the people to love and care for him, give him their allegiance. No social media as yet. Just requital is the origin of good order or disorder for Xunzi. That much is plain. So how much is a well-intentioned power holder to try to ensure that there's just requital for every good and bad act? And why then does Xunzi spend so much time on the morning rituals in his chapter on ritual? Well, in truth, Xunzi's chapter entitled On Ritual concerns two kinds of ritual activities, one of which is often forgotten. It's not only mourning for the dead, but also sumptuary regulations for the living and the dead. Both of these types of rituals are said to be inherited from the wise kings of yore, and both have different, if congruent, functions. Let me begin with the sumptuary regulations. In an imperfect but better world, Xunzi says, hereditary standing, which often meant hereditary wealth, would count for very little, while community contributions, or the lack thereof, as well as community harms, would count very heavily. Sumptuary regulations can be written with a view to undergirding the notion that a given person will be allowed to consume more or fewer luxury items, carriages, robes, concubines, all of this, and consume them in public as well as at home, according to the number and quality of his or her societal contributions. As people operating at a very crude level of thinking, i.e. the quid pro quo, the transactional, I give in order to get, soon see whose actions get rewarded in this better world, they will begin to emulate those constructive people and their constructive actions, initially in the hopes of acquiring more goods, psychological and material, for themselves. And while they may begin with the crude notion, how can I get ahead in life the fastest possible way, once they embark on this course of action, they will find the intangible rewards, such as social approbation, good reputation, at least as important as the tangible in inducing them to act well. And by acting well, I always mean in cooperative and constructive ways, leading to a common goal of benefit to the community. Sumptuary regulations can go a long way then towards instilling the very habits of the heart, mind, and body that promote socio-political order. Without them, the rites do not, and indeed cannot, promote social order. Mourning rites then build on and further refine those habits insofar as they're premised on the notion that all people, when confronted with death, need to act so as to convert their natural dread of corpses. And Xunzi goes into this. They stink. They are decomposing in the front room. And you need to convert this dread into something more constructive in their lives. Second, that the forms of ritual action equally communicate one's love for the dead and one's ongoing commitment to the survivors in the community, and so satisfy the need to respond and repair the rupture. And C, the conduct of the mourning rites, meanwhile, also reassure the person that he or she, in some sense, will live on after death, in people's memories at the very least, or in family standing. Miraculously, and I use that word because Xunzi uses that word, these things are shun, they are divine. Okay. The mourning rites address all three simultaneous needs and thereby prove their worth. No matter what ideas about the afterlife the mourners bring to their observances. And the mourning rites do this for two reasons. The mourning rites are themselves to be graded according to the contributions made by the dead person to the individual and community now in mourning. And they prescribe a reasonable but not excessive amount of time to mourn for one's honored dead before re-immersion into daily life. They ensure then both that people pay their respects and move on as is appropriate, returning to their regular tasks without survivor's guilt or shame. But even more crucially in Xunzi's view is this: a willingness to engage in the solemn mourning rites represents the single best confirmation for oneself and others of the mourners being duly mindful of their dependence on others and incurring obligations to others. After all, the mourners perform that dependence and sense of intergenerational duty and equity, no matter that the dead are unconscious and they cannot harm the living who do not pay off their debts. And again, Xunzi says this quite explicitly. And no matter what other pressing tasks might otherwise prove to be distractions for the mourners. In consequence, a willingness to requite the dead bespeaks a strong willingness to accord the living their due, and such requital is the single most important foundation for a stable, constructive order. Paying one's psychological debts turns out to be the definition of the noble man, the Xunzi. When in power, that noble man, realizing his fundamental dependence on the work of others, sees to it that those others receive their just deserts. Here on screen is one representative passage. I don't think I'll go through all of it, but one of the things I'm terribly interested in this passage, as in other texts from the early empires, is how much good treatment is to be accorded the disadvantaged, the orphans, those living alone, the widowers or widows. Therefore, as the way the subordinates loved their superiors, they delighted in them as if they were their own parents, and they could be killed, i.e. in battle, but not be made disobedient. This way of operating happens, in other words, not because the nobleman or the ruler, by a definition, is a good guy, okay? This is the preferred way of operating for smart people in power, okay? It's just that simple. They know their strongest support, as well as their best sources of information, are to be secured by the willing cooperation of the subordinates. One other point that Xunzi emphasizes in his chapter on ritual: both the external form and the internal disposition in the ritual must be aligned if transformative ritual that makes you more of a human being, is to occur. And that's why Maoqing, behavior and emotions, appears in Xunzi, along with Nei Wai, Biao Li, inner and outer, what can be seen, what cannot. What Xunzi precisely is not talking about then is something like Foucault's governmentality, where we self-censor our behavior in order to better harmonize our wills and our bodies with social units we need or want to belong to. There is a finer goal to pursue, to become a full human being, to realize one's potential, to Changren. The result then is a society shaped by ritual habits and ritualized patterns of social interaction. Herb Fingerat reminded us that ritual can be a handshake, saying, I see you, I acknowledge your presence. That this is not coincidentally a society shaped by a just sense of what individuals, families, and the community as a whole owe each person, if the person is to receive his or her just deserts, grading according to contributions. Giver and receiver both must understand the obligation, and so there is no need for contracts or tallies to make people do the right thing. Xunzi uses the phrase li yi, and while we typically regard this as two nouns, he often uses it verbally. Li, we don't seem to have a problem translating, although we often have the things in mind, but many translators don't want to even translate E. I would say that this is with a sense of duty to accord people equitable treatment. And I think every passage that one reads, that is the end goal. So I like to translate E as duty, but then what kind of duty? And then Xunzi explains, okay? So the result of this action in ritual and with a sense of duty would be a sense of equity, a trust in one's society and in the interconnectedness that needs to prevail. In 130 uses of li yi, that is what it's getting to. In many cases, Xunzi speaks of li yi, zhiwen, the patterns created by the behavior that conforms to these two norms. Thus do responsible members of the community act by act lead other members to realize their human goals, stable orders in which members of the community can ascertain and feel secure in their own true places. In the end, as it began then, through propagation of the rights and successive acts of transformation, rooted in a sense of what is always due others, that makes for a true and lasting equitable order forged by all. Only in this way can all these goals be achieved simultaneously. No part of Xunzi's four-part formula can be jettisoned if an equitable society is to be put in place. And yet Xunzi's prescriptions seem simple, maybe too simple. After all, we have yet to realize such an equitable society. The devil is in the details, of course. People have a devil of a time deciding what they actually owe to others and what form repayment can usefully take. But if we today follow Xunzi's criteria, one he has adopted from earlier thinkers, we owe it to others not to render them invisible, even when they are out of sight. We owe it to others to accord them dignity, even when they do not appear to be sufficiently civilized as yet. If we give others their due, protecting them even when they seem as unformed and uncivilized as newborn babes, we ourselves can complete the circle. What began to induce order in the antique eras can and will induce order in contemporary times. Wisely, Xunzi never promises a utopia. He reminds us that the best men have suffered in history under the worst regimes. Nonetheless, the best men and women can salvage during seemingly hopeless times a sense that they have achieved some part of their own human potential. They are fallible yet effective guides for others. By the end, the best men and women can define themselves by their own developmental courses, rather than by being cravenly dependent upon the evaluations of others or upon worldly success. And let us not forget the rights work because they provide personal satisfaction as well as a sense of intergenerational community and equity. And on balance, they provide a mechanism to secure societal approbation. And when all is said and done, when one cannot find friends among one's peers and colleagues, one can make friends in history, something Mencius also realized. Or so Xunzi promises us. And in the end, our human capacity to crowd together for a common purpose should mean that with the right guidance from history, from good teachers and good leaders, one should be able in most regimes to come closer to approximating the glory days of old, wherein each got his due, ge qi yi, and each attained his or own proper place, ge qi so, and knowing that contributed contentedly to the project of the common good. One last note on the subject that cannot be ignored, and then I turn to Aristotle quickly. The vocabulary used in classical Chinese sources to identify the main actors in governing is remarkably vague, and I believe intentionally so. Vague, so as not to offend the reigning powers that be, who are often the recipients of the rhetoric, and vague enough to allow for those besides the current power holders to weigh in on policy matters and accrue power over time. Let me just give a few examples. The word routinely translated as ruler or nobleman, Xunzi, in many instances means the person qualified to rule due to his temperament, his eagerness to learn from others, his willingness to defer to others' judgments in decision-making. Similarly, the term for king, as often as not, referred solely to the hypothetical true king serving the common good. Conversely, the fuel and fodder gatherers, i.e. the landless, lowliest ranking people in the realm, might contain in their group true gentlemen, they're called Xunzi, equipped with far-sighted plans. Meanwhile, sure, a term that once indicated nobles permitted to wear a sword soon came to mean experts in a given technical field, particularly consultants to the reigning powers. Also in this connection, it is absolutely vital that we see during the early empires in China, the sage is defined by his awareness that he is not omniscient, okay? So the sage in the early empires couldn't be more different than the sage in Song and post-Song, Neo-Confucian construction. I can do chapter and verse, but trust me on this, I have chapter and verse, or ask a question. It's equally vital to recall that in the classical Chinese language, we don't typically specify number, tense, case, or gender. All meaning is thus contextually determined, and all the more so in manuscript culture. This allows for considerable latitude in interpretation, and one must interpret Xunzi's meaning not at the level of individual graphs, but by looking for larger patterns in his texts. This explains why we sometimes do not know when reading whether we're reading a factual, an analogical, or a wholly hypothetical account. But once we pretend to certainty, we have forfeited the right to call ourselves good readers of Xunzi. At this juncture at the talk, I would like to gesture briefly towards the real-life consequences as I see them. I'm working on local communities in early China, and what I want to talk about is the early empire's desire to put Xunzi's vision in practice. We have tons of visual and also local bamboo strips that are talking about this. And what I want to present to you is that as early in 1975, a hard-headed historian, Tone Holseve, called early China a proto-welfare state. It would be hard to overemphasize the singularity of this implicit social contract between ruler and ruled that the early empires in China devised, since no such social contract has ever been found to have a counterpart in Greece, Near East, or the Roman empires. I give two examples on here on the slide. This is an AD 5 edict, complete, found on how to do good agricultural work for the benefit of the local community. And it has 203 provisions, if I remember all of this. Anyway, it's been completely reconstructed. And on the right, what we have is a Han pictorial stone that shows a member who is aged with a dove staff that gave him legal privileges and also free food from the government once he was sufficiently aged. What I'm finding, the more I look, is everywhere we're seeing these things, and we're seeing them in unimpeachable sources from the time. Okay? Now, because I'm a guest of Sonia Osby, I promised to say something by way of comparing Xunzi to Aristotle. I'm almost done. I'm a firm admirer of Aristotle, needless to say, who could not be? But when I begin to think whose work speaks more to the modern predicaments we confront, hands down, Xunzi provides the better answers for us today. Let me first say what I think the two thinkers share in common, and then explain why Xunzi's writings seem far more relative to me. First, neither thinker is particularly concerned with a precise form of government. Aristotle's politics is equally content to talk of good republics, good oligarchies, good monarchies, so long as those forms of rule provide the right sort of training to the citizens in the polis. Xunzi is fully aware that human societies were once far more primitive, and then they became more sophisticated and centralized, and so forms of government may change for him too, now and in the future. Both, in consequence, are preoccupied with the educative function of the polity on the individual, family, and polity, even if Aristotle cannot explore this question too deeply, given his own tenuous position in Athens. Number two, both thinkers are zetetic. That's a big word I learned, okay? And what it means is preoccupied that people ask the right questions rather than dispositive. Certain that if they can get us to pose the right questions of the societies we inhabit, we will arrive at interesting conclusions that will help us make sure the societies we live in are good ones. Third, both thinkers would agree that the best person is he who, as Aristotle says, has an appetite for the things he ought, as he ought, doing, in other words, as he ought, when he ought, and this is what reason directs. For Xunzi, the important distinction between the great man and the petty man lies in the simple fact that the Xunzi alone is led by what reason directs. He can see how his present acts conduce or impede getting to his final goal, whereas the petty man cannot. Both thinkers would agree that an act to be good must fulfill three conditions. It must be voluntary rather than coerced or imposed. It must be done with the aim of bringing about a constructive end. And the act must reflect the person's conscious and careful assessment of the situation at hand, including an assessment of whether any action is warranted at the moment at all. Both thinkers presume that to live well means living courageously, like a warrior, but neither thinker advises rash behavior. Last, neither Aristotle nor Xunzi would recognize rational choice theory as having any bearing on a just society. Here I would cite Bernard Williams, a great philosopher, asserting that the ancients were simply in much better shape than more modern Christian and Kantian thinkers determined to elevate moral considerations far above the pragmatic. There are several reasons that I celebrate Xunzi. Xunzi has a far keener sense of history as mirror, and thus he can test how things really do work in the real world, how they have worked and are known to have worked. A corollary is this then, contra the common wisdom. His project says little and cares less about the inborn nature at birth, as he is focused rather on a process whereby the human potential to become an impressive person may be achieved by most people. In other words, how they acquire a second nature. By contrast, Aristotle's sense of history seems remarkably thin, as he is preoccupied with explaining current power relations among those who act in the real world he knows. Things happen in time yet, but what happens doesn't seem to change the nature of the polity, the family unit, or the individual. Number two, unlike Aristotle, Xunzi can think deeply about servile status, as he doesn't live in a society where the break between citizen and slave is absolute, insofar as it defines political participation and civic engagement. Aristotle needs slaves to support the citizens in various acts of self-development. By contrast, Xunzi doesn't need to define freedom solely in political or economic terms, i.e. in non-slavery, where freedom inevitably implies mastery over others. Therefore, Xunzi can speak to what means for the gentleman of non-servile status to be enslaved by things or by people, and also to be enslaved by the chase after the idea of worldly success, often to no avail. Number three, and this is my last point, Xunzi, unlike Aristotle, does not introduce a great deal of troublesome vocabulary. I mean, it's taken me years to have a tenuous grasp of Aristotle's four causes. He is a political realist who uses his terms consistently and clearly, and what I mean by political realist is what people like Raymond Geuss mean. If you make one choice, it has consequences for the choices you didn't make. I vastly prefer thinking about what it means to connect mastery over oneself to the welfare, physical and spiritual, of the larger community, living and dead. To me, this is the really important idea we can wrest from Xunzi, an insight that tallies not only with my experience, but it recalls a lot of modern writings penned by, among others, Virginia Woolf and James Joyce. I'm thinking of Virginia Woolf's "The Future is Dark," and that is the best thing, I think, for it to be. Also, her comment in A Room of One's Own, that men don't seek consciously to put down women, but rather they need badly to feel superior to them. Quite an interesting distinction. Xunzi gives us a way to feel powerful and superior without the need to put anyone else down. In fact, we can only feel powerful and secure and impressive if we don't put down others. In that, he's a true Confucian. You'll remember the Analects says, the job of human beings is to treat each person as a dignitary upon meeting them. On a closing note, in Habits of the Heart, the authors followed Tocqueville's pioneering analysis of the social results of the new political form of democracy. Tocqueville saw a variety of unique features in American democracy, especially what he called equality of condition and famously individualism. The authors then went on to identify resources to correct the unfortunate tendencies of too much equality and too much individualism. It seems to me that Xunzi works as well or better than de Tocqueville when we come to think about freedom, equality, equity, and individualism today. I welcome all comments and criticisms on what I've said. Thank you. First comment.
Hi.
Hi.
And so Xunzi was different because he was a local official for quite a while, right? I don't know exactly
Well, he
how
was
long.
a local libationer. And yes, in his
Right,
home
so a very practical kind of guy, as opposed to Confucius kept losing jobs.
yeah,
Right.
yeah, well, there's a reason I
Right.
warrant, but
And
anyway.
on the other hand, Xunzi is also not very happy or well off in terms of his disciples, Lisa and Han Feize, right?
I think I would rethink Han Feize, but I absolutely know where
But
you're
in
going.
terms of the popular understanding,
The popular
that they
understanding.
came from him, right?
Yeah,
And then also he
Yeah.
lost, of course, to Mencius. And so could you talk about those three kinds
Oh,
of things?
geez,
His
that's-
practical
let's-
approach as an official?
let's go all through 2,000 years of history. Let me take the simplest one first.
Sure.
Okay. He lost out to Mencius over time. And I think that is because of the anointing by someone who was then on the far ideological fringe called Jushi, who moves into the ideological center. And Jushi basically wants to displace everything that can be associated with the Han and Tang and devise a new way forward. And so Xunzi prevails through Tang. I think that's a pretty good reign. Okay, I'd say through northern Song, I think, maybe into southern Song. So I think, of course, it distresses me when I read books on Chinese law that say, well, we only need to look at the Analects and Mencius because Chinese law is Confucian law and Confucianism is only the Analects and Mencius plus the Zhongyong and the Daxue. My upset is not troubling anybody else in the world, okay? Your question about Xunzi as a local official, we know he traveled to the capital as well. Or we think we know. Sometimes we're not omniscient either. And we know that he had powerful disciples, among them also Li Si, who in the end didn't have such a great reputation, but is actually often celebrated in the Han period, despite his evil deeds, for being a magnificent inventor of Chinese calligraphy. Okay, Han Feize, it depends on which chapter you're reading, but I would have killed Han Feize if I were a ruler. Okay, not to be trusted, okay? Yes. Nonetheless, there are chapters in the Han Feize that share a great deal with the Xunzi, just not the ones we usually read. Okay, you had a third question, and that was?
I think that's all. And
Okay.
whether I assume he had a certain amount of autonomy as a local official that the other folks did not tend to have.
Yes, one of the things that is absolutely true, even into the Qin and Han empires, contra the common wisdom, is how much local autonomy was factored into the situation. We have now 5 documents whose titles are basically all the same, How to Be a Good Official, and all of them describe, that means taking initiative in the spirit of the laws rather than in keeping to the fine points of the laws. And so that requires thinking people on the ground and organizing of local communities. The irony is that Jushi then, a big local community guy, chooses Mencius, who says nothing about local community, whereas Xunzi says quite a lot about a local community. So yes, I absolutely think that when we have in this picture this top-down autocratic one-man rule, everything about it is wrong if you're a historian. That's not, because I'm translating the documents, I have on my computer somewhere, and I'm happy to send it, something from the Izhou Shu that shows 9 people wearing the pearl crown and on the dais. Okay, 9 people. And the others in the room are supposed to be their advisors, gathered there in the Wang Hui chapter to advise the ruler. The words that are used often in Han Dynasty is that the definition of a ruler is he who inclines to hear those below him in rank. And of course, Xunzi came very close to Mencius in saying the ruler himself must go if he's not a good ruler. He, in effect, said hereditary standing should be not a criterion by which you judge governing. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. Please.
Aristotle said famously little about the study of history or history writing, and compares it unfavorably to the writing of epic. In the Poetics, he just mentions it really to say that epic talks about what could be, and historiography is really just the enumeration of events. In your talk, you described one of the major points of distinction between Aristotle and Xunzi as being that Xunzi has more of a historical grounding. I wonder whether you might elaborate on that. My underlying question, I guess, being that I wonder whether it is, since Aristotle doesn't require it, or doesn't feel he requires a historical basis, is Xunzi really just tacking this on as a matter of form?
I don't think so. Okay, thank you. That's, as the earlier question's an excellent question. I think prior to Gen Z, or maybe a generation, or Henry Ford, history is bunk, the way people decided that they understood something about how the world worked was always by looking at history. And here's the thing they said. So history's mirror is throughout Xunzi and every other Chinese thinker. And what they meant was, of course, there are no exact analogies, but when you look at human motivation and what will draw people to you or repel them from you, how you build up trust has not changed all that much over time. And so Xunzi, this is absolutely central to his project. I actually don't think, and I'm going to go out on it, I don't translate Ru as Confucian, but I do translate it as classicist. And what do I mean by that? You're good at history and the rights. Okay, both those are things that have come down from earlier times. And all of their calculations depend. Xunzi has a chapter that says, what is the efficacy of being a classicist? And it's all about, you have the basis for good, never perfect, but in all likelihood, this is, if you act this way, this is what will end up being. And throughout the Xunzi, he's citing specific people and specific cases that he knows of. I think more than us who were trained in the post-1950s social science version of history, what he means by history is a knowledge of exemplary figures and what happened to them and why, a discussion of what happened to them. But this is absolutely crucial to his grounding. It's the only way he can prove that when people have followed in earlier times something analogous to what he advocates, people became powerful and secure as a result. Okay? And he does talk about those cases and how they fell apart as well. Does that help?
Yes, it does.
Okay. No, if it doesn't help, let me try to do better.
I don't want to take too much time.
Okay. Okay.
Yes. Hi. Thank
Yes.
you, Professor Nylan. I have one perhaps related question about history. I feel when I read early Chinese texts, I feel there's a profound awareness of human limitation. There's a pervasive existence of diversity, of change. Everything is uncertain. So history is not really, you might say, we perhaps wouldn't even associate it with structures because they are real limited to particular examples, particular models that could potentially guide us.
Every one is different. Every
Yes.
event is different. Yes.
Yeah, I feel this could perhaps help us understand Xunzi or early Chinese thinkers better.
I totally agree. And I think one of my earliest publications was on a book called The Canon of Supreme Mystery. And I think by and large, people in Chinese philosophy haven't taken that seriously. First, Yang Sheng is the greatest philosopher of the Han Dynasty. Everybody knew it, everybody acknowledged it. But more importantly, what's behind that? This sense that life is uncertain. And so how can we get some sense of self-satisfaction even when the worst things are happening around us? Okay. I think about that a lot because I love and don't love America. And I think of it a lot as our universities become more corporate and less places of inquiry. I think we can all point to things we find profoundly discouraging, and then we have to say, well, what is the project to which we're committed? And I'm committed for environmental and educational reasons to thinking harder about intergenerational equity. And so one can see that in every community, if you're going to join with people, and this is why it so often goes wrong, you have to find a modus vivendi despite your differences. And of course, Berkeley is famous in the life of Brian for being mocked by all of the people around Jesus who cannot get along in their far left view. Yeah, that's what it can be like. But we don't have a lot more time to waste. So I think the notion that we need to be acting in common with people we disagree with is quite important. And I personally grew up in a family of politicians committed to civil rights. And I saw all kinds of things happen, including my virtual father talking to people he absolutely disagreed with in ways that promoted a common goal. So I probably am predisposed to think about this, but I think it's something we as humans need to think about since we seem to be hell-bent on destruction, right? Thank you for your comment. Anything else? I thought someone would fight with me by saying Xunzi couldn't give a hoot about human nature when one is born. Because if you do word searches in CAJ or in philosophy, they always, that's the only thing Xunzi is known for. And we don't even think the title of that essay is probably his title. Essays are often given later on. If it is his title, then fine. But it's not what his first paragraph starts with, and usually titles begin with what first paragraphs begin with in manuscript culture. So I suspect it's a later editorial edition, but whether or not it's a later editorial edition, he gives it about a sentence or two in the chapter, where he comes out very much like Confucius and Yang Sheng. And they say people are born pretty much alike, and then they grow different by culture. Pretty vague, open-ended statement. Yeah. Anyway, I'm sure you all want to go have lunch, maybe. Any last?
I have another question yet, if you want one.
Sure. Up to you.
So anyway, despite stressing the fact that Xunzi wanted people to work for a larger good than for themselves, some of the description sounds awfully transactional.
Oh, you begin transactionally. Absolutely. Right. I want that.
Right, and then Bao itself, you add just as an adjective when it's not necessarily in there.
I think it's exactly what is also going on in the Xunzi, where, in the Analects, where Confucius over and over again says, well, you need to take the first step. You're not going to understand this if you just stand outside and look at it. And so what he is, and Gruss would say this in 1901, once someone says, oh, you cute little thing when you do this, aren't you polite? Aren't you lovable, then you begin to do it for other reasons that are not merely transactional, unless we consider such complicated things as societal approbation transactional.
So there needs to be a focus on why you're doing things as opposed to what you're actually doing.
And that's why we need history and teachers and leaders and if we don't have those, we really can only read books.
So I look at the world mostly through popular literature. I'm teaching Xioji, Journey to the West now. The dividing line pretty much between a demon and non-demon, whether it's Monkey King and his later self, is why he does what he does,
Yes,
whether he does it for
exactly.
himself or others, right?
And in Chinese law, that is the only question you ask, not what has been committed, but intentionality. And there are lines saying that in Xunzi, there are lines saying that in Qin and Han law. We have those lines. The Documents Classic says the same thing. It is what you intended to do, not.
And there's later concern
Things-
how you monitor what people are doing. So
Exactly.
Ganyin Ken, you have these spirits who are doing like Santa's list to see who's doing good stuff and bad stuff, right? And there's a Ye Jing in hell that you have your reruns of all your past
Right.
deeds. And then you have the Qin mirror, from which you can see into people's hearts. But you also have the concept of yin de, secret merit, right?
Of
Which
course.
is especially important
course.
because nobody knows.
Right.
So you're not doing it for
And
other
so
people.
that's, in a sense, even higher than the mourning rites.
Mhm.
The dead doesn't know in the mourning rites, according to Xunzi, but you're doing this nonetheless for the community. Just as Xunzi, as a local official, was engaging in divination all the time, and he provides for it because this allows the community to be secure and all of that. But I think Inde is said of people like Zhou and the notion is that they're willing for no one to know this.
The casket business, right?
The metal
Where he
bound
does the
casket
prayer. Mhm.
in the documents. So that is the ultra. But the fact that you're willing to act in virtuous ways that no one else can see and that cause you some little trouble has nothing to do with the fact that you're omniscient. You are acting in the way that societal norms have said you should act. And in the Documents Classic, and actually I'm embarrassed to say it took me 4 years to see this, Zhou himself, but also others, say repeatedly, I do not dare to claim to know X, Y, and Z, including heaven's will. So I'm doing the best I can by the society I've grown up in to achieve ends I've thought about committing myself to achieving.
I was told that we are out of time. Thank you, Dr. Nylan, for this talk and for not talking about Xunzi's view of human nature. This was a fresh breath of air. We all appreciated that. Thanks.
So thank you. Thanks for being an attentive audience. I have written, and when I said this is just something about, I've written 70 single-space pages or something about my first take on the Xunzi-Aristotle problem. And why was I doing that problem? Because Sonia invited me before the pandemic. So if anybody wants longer, I didn't actually consult the essay. I just sat down and said, what do I think has to be said about Xunzi and Aristotle? So I don't know how closely it maps on, but it can't be completely different. But anyway, thank you for being a good audience. Thank you.